welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to be talking about the Iron Sheik biography. Again, this one, they knocked it out of the park. Absolutely fantastic. This is in the top 10 of the ones that they've done. Dusty is in the top 10. Of all the biographies they've done so far, these have been excellent. As usual, we're not going to go through the entire biography. Plus, a lot of this biography is cribbed from the Iron Sheik's documentary. So I actually did a video on the Iron Sheik's documentary. I will post it in the description or in the comment section. So if you want to go through the story of the Iron Sheik, we can talk about it there. So here, we're just going to do some highlights from the Iron Sheik biography on A&E. So the first thing that I want to talk about that comes from this biography is that Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik, he was the bodyguard of the Shah of Iran. Now, there's a little history lesson. I was forced to learn this, so I might as well go ahead and share it with everyone. During the Iranian Revolution, when the Ayatollahs took over, they overthrew a guy named the Shah of Iran. He was considered a United States puppet that was bringing Western culture into Iran. So if you ever seen some pictures of like young Iranian women on the beach in bikinis and stuff like that, that was usually during the era of the Shah. This was before a hard Muslim takeover of Iran. So when Iran was taken over by the Ayatollahs, this will become interesting, of course, important to the character of the Iron Sheik. But he had already left the country by then because the Shah was, of course, a terrible dictator. We can't say that, that the Shah was a nice guy. He was just the dictator that was friendlier with the United States. And the Ayatollah was a dictator who was hostile to Western culture in terms of women being naked on beaches and, stuff like that. He just was not having it. So I just wanted to bring that up because I thought that was very interesting and something that a lot of people don't know. So Vaziri was the bodyguard of the Shah of Iran, and the Shah was the guy who was overthrown and I believe killed or led into exile. I forget which one it was when the Ayatollahs took over in the late 70s in Iran. Interestingly enough, and this is an important thing, while Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik, was still in Iran working probably as a bodyguard for the Shah, there was a man by the name of Edward Farhat, a Lebanese wrestler, going by the name the Sheik. He is the original Sheik. He is the uncle of Sabu. This version of the Sheik, or this man named the Sheik, is what a lot of territorial wrestling fans know as the Sheik. He was a blood and guts, fire and ice pick kind of bad guy who wore a lot of the same garb that the Iron Sheik would be known for, but he did it first. He was also a huge star, especially in my hometown of Detroit. He used to run Cobo Arena and was a really big star here for a really long time. So I kind of have those mixed feelings about how much I really adore the Iron Sheik, and knowing the history of the Lebanese Sheik Farhat. But Khosrow Vaziri is legit, while Farhat, he is the child of immigrants. He only spoke English and he grew up actually Catholic. He didn't grow up Muslim. Vaziri is a real Muslim from Iran who speaks, the language. And it seems that while Farhat created the look and, he did capitalize on the gimmick, the version of Sheik Farhat, he didn't speak. He was mostly a person who didn't talk. He only spoke English. So he was almost animalistic in a way at times. Anyway, this is interesting because you see how somebody can create a gimmick and be somewhat authentic, and then somebody else can come along and be the genuine article. They were both capitalizing off the same thing, but Khosrow Vaziri was a genuine Iranian And it was at the right time too, because the original Sheik had been wrestling in the 50s and in the 60s, and about the 70s and 80s he was getting a little older. It wasn't quite the same thing. He had kind of run his course, I guess you could say. And Brian Solomon, in his book Blood and Fire, on Sheik Farhat, he made sure that people realized that Vaziri might be a top star in WWF history, but he pales in comparison to the original Sheik and how much money that guy drew, and how he was actually part of the booker in the Detroit Territory. So, I mean, you could be a top guy, but ain't nothing like being a top guy and the booker at the same time. Oh boy, you're the man at that point, right? So that book, and a lot of people who know a little bit about territorial wrestling, they are very staunch that the Iron Sheik be put into context, and that is that he is in some ways a secondary Sheik, as the guy who lost the belt to Hulk Hogan, who was champion for less than a month, and then who proceeded for the next few years to do tag teams and then crack cocaine afterwards. While the original Sheik was a savvy businessman who ran his own territory, who was still a top draw in many territories that he went into, and actually created the gimmick of the Sheik. And it happens, like, I think I look at the Sheik situation the same way I look at the Nature Boy situation. Yeah, somebody did it first, but you can't deny how perfect, Vaziri is as the Iron Sheik. Even if you want to just say it was a mostly creation of the WWF winning the National Wrestling expansion, and then they can just take control of wrestling history and push other people out, and that might be true. And yeah, that does make Sheik Farhat pretty much one of those guys that's going to be forgotten, which is why writing books on him and things like that is very good. But at the same time, though, I think that it is in some ways a belittling of the Iron Sheik. So but it needs to be said. It needs to go without, it goes without saying. You can't talk about Nature Boy Ric Flair without talking about Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, and you can't talk about Buddy Rogers without talking about Gorgeous George. People get their gimmicks from somewhere, right? We'll never see a gimmick like the Sheik again. You can forget it. I don't think any Arab or Muslim wrestler will want to do the character. They'd probably be shamed if they did try to do it. You'll definitely never see another Muslim wrestler do the character, so you can pretty much forget it. So that means that these two guys who did these gimmicks, they are treasures, both of them. Two guys, well, technically Iranians are not Arabs. They are Persians. It's a difference, okay? So you have an Arab in Edward Farhat who did the gimmick, and you have a Persian in Khosrow Vaziri who did the gimmick. And these two guys are peerless. They also mentioned in the book quite, and it's, I think, out of respect, that when the Iron Sheik, even though he was given the name Iron Sheik, he would still perform in other territories where Sheik Farhat was known under a different name. So he would wrestle under different names in other places. And it wasn't until he got to the WWF that he became essentially the Iron Sheik everywhere. This kind of thing happened a lot in wrestling when guys shared names. For instance, Bruiser Brody, he was given the name Bruiser Brody in the WWF. He was given the name the Bruiser Brody, but when he would go where Dick the Bruiser was known, you can't have two Bruisers, he would go King Kong Brody. Guys who go by King, when they went to Memphis, because Jerry the King Lawler, they would use a different name. So that kind of respect was always there. And it was very interesting that's another thing that Vince kicked the door in on is, guys not utilizing the same names or the same gimmicks as other guys who were previously known in that area. And basically not introducing ripoffs or not mixing the intellectual property. Vince will also sometimes try to overthrow the previous intellectual property if he could. One of his things was King Harley Race. I think they talk about this in one of the books that I read. I wish I could remember which one, where Jerry the King Lawler actually sued Vince McMahon for running King Harley Race, because it was a mix of his trademark of Jerry the King Lawler, of who was the King of Memphis and the King of Memphis Wrestling. And he actually won, believe it or not. So Vince couldn't run a king in Memphis that was not Jerry the King Lawler. Interesting, right? But it was mostly done for other wrestlers. It was done out of respect. You know, no two bruisers, no two Sheiks. So I like that. You know, that was great. And usually when a guy is using the same or a similar gimmick, there's very little crossover between the two. Like, which is, you know, the Buddy Landel situation, where you have Nature Boy Buddy Landel and you have Nature Boy Ric Flair, and it's like, what's going on here? You know, why are you doing this? You know, what's this about? But Ric Flair had actually wrestled Buddy Rogers before, you know, so sometimes there is enough overlap, but most of the time they have it. As far as I know, Vaziri has never wrestled Farhat. I haven't seen it anywhere in any book or anything, so I don't know if they've ever met in terms of like actually met each other. So it's, to me, I feel like it's always an interesting story to tell when it comes to the two Sheiks. Another little highlight from here is how they talk about the title switch and Hulk Hogan and all this stuff. All right, so what they left out. For starters, let's talk about what they told, and then we'll talk about what they left out. So the story goes, of course, that the Iron Sheik didn't know he was going to become WWE champion until Vince told him, which is usually how it happens, right? And he didn't give him enough notice to even tell his wife, so his wife was surprised when it happened. And Sheik, of course, looks at this as, you know, one of the highlights of his life is that he became world champion somewhere in the Madison Square Garden, as he calls it. And Hulk Hogan comes in, because we're transitioning from Bob Backlund to Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan's going to come in. He's going to be the guy that's going to beat him. And Vern Gagne offers money for Iron Sheik to break Hulk Hogan's leg and not drop the title to him. Now, of course, they did tell the story, and it makes sense that Vern Gagne was one of the trainers of the Iron Sheik. Well, he trained the Iron Sheik in pro wrestling, and it was kind of like he was trying to cash in on a favor. Hulk Hogan, of course, you know, was also a Vern Gagne. Well, he was in AWA at the time as a top star, working with Nick Bockwinkel. They were doing the chase up there, and Hogan was kind of tired of doing the chase and, you know, wrestling for the title and never winning it. So Hogan decided he was going to jump ship. Now, the reason why Vern Gagne wanted Hulk Hogan's leg broken is because Vince swiped Hulk Hogan while he was still being advertised in the AWA. So Hogan had pretty much refused to continue doing dates in the AWA, which of course crushed AWA business because he was their top babyface. And this is why the Iron Sheik was propositioned with $100,000 to break Hulk Hogan's leg. And you know what the weirdest thing about this is? And at least it was at least $100,000, and this is just a estimate. Most people think it might be more, it might be less, whatever. Is that later in the biography they mention that Iron Sheik made $100,000 on action figures. So him doing the job for Hulk Hogan made him far more money than breaking Hulk Hogan's leg would have. Playing the long-term game versus the short-term game. There's a lot of people who would have been like, look, I'd have just broke Hulk Hogan's leg. It's $100,000. And without knowing how much was possible, I guess you could take that short-term lump, you know, the bird in the hand, but then you would have had to trust Vern Gagne. You know, but I'm pretty sure Iron Sheik probably did trust Vern Gagne because, you know, it was his trainer and he had helped him so much. But most people wouldn't have trusted Vern Gagne with money, you know, if you know his history, which if you don't, he didn't like paying people, you know, wasn't a big fan of paying guys. So He might have paid him $100,000 in like $25 intervals or some shit like that. You never know. But in any way, it shows that being a stand-up dude, being somebody with good moral character, you actually get more in the end. Now, there is, of course, still some bitterness there because the Iron Sheik felt like he wanted the title longer, and he felt like he should have had it longer, and he was a real wrestler, and he should have, been able to reap more of the rewards of all of his hard work instead of the quick turnaround, because he was champion less than a month. It's a similar situation that Superstar Billy Graham went through. Superstar Billy Graham, if you guys don't know, he was the guy who beat Bruno Sammartino before he ended up losing the belt to Bob Backlund. And it was a similar thing. Bruno was huge. Nobody thought that he was going to lose. He ended up losing it to Superstar Billy Graham. Superstar Billy Graham ended up at least maintaining business, was tremendous, and he fell into a bit of a funk after he lost the title. It kind of crushed his confidence, because it showed him that no matter what he did, it wasn't going to change what was on the books already, what Vince McMahon Sr. had already put in place, and that was for Bob Backlund to be the champion. It was already promised to him. So even though Billy Graham was overproducing in terms of sellouts and money drawing, he wasn't going to change his mind on that. And this is why you need to be a little bit more flexible in your planning, right? Because I definitely think they could have lasted a lot longer with Superstar Billy Graham, especially if they'd have turned on babyface. I mean, fuck. It would have been printing cash. Anyway, so it was a similar situation with the Iron Sheik, where he felt like he was really just getting started. He hadn't had time to get old yet. The gimmick was working. He had incredible amounts of heat, and he's really just hitting the vein. And to flip it so quickly to Hogan, even though he got to, run a series of matches with Hogan, so he didn't hurt like he had one match with Hogan and that was it. They went around the horn, but to lose that it bothered him, because we started seeing the transition to sports entertainment, from sports to sports entertainment. The business of guys like Viziri, like Backlund, like Thez, who were legitimate grapplers, who will only lose to other legitimate grapplers, that day was gone. Even though it still wasn't a lot of that, because that the string had been broken a long time ago. But the visual of the amateur wrestler as being the world champion, the best in the business, it was destroyed with Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan couldn't throw his punches, they were decent, but they weren't going to break an egg. In a real fight, you're not too concerned about Hulk Hogan and his big leg and his leg drop. It's all theatrics. So going from athletics to theatrics, which is what Vince wanted to do, and which is what wrestling had been doing off and on for a long time. Edward Farhat, to go back to that, was a guy who, he had somewhat of an amateur background, but his entire gimmick was fire and blood and biting and all that kind of stuff, not good graps. Okay, it was spectacle, it was theatrics. And going from athletes to theatrics is what the WWF did better than anybody else, and did it loudly and proudly and didn't care. And the Iron Sheik was a victim of that, because he could do both. He was a perfect bridge between the two. He was big and theatrical as the Iron Sheik, but he also had a real amateur background, where if he was in real trouble, he can handle himself, So the Iron Sheik is like the last of a dying breed that didn't actually come back until, Bret Hart and Kurt Angle several years later, of guys who had like legitimate amateur backgrounds. And even Bret Hart, his was like in high school, so it wasn't like he was an NCAA champion. He was Canadian anyway. But of course, Kurt Angle is a completely different level of success for amateur wrestlers. But Kurt Angle is a throwback in a real way. But other than that, a lot of wrestlers have become guys who were mostly theatrical. So when Iron Sheik says, "I'm a real wrestler, not like Hulk Hogan," it's like, yeah, you know, but that day is gone. And that day today, long gone. And in a way, this interesting dichotomy here is why Hogan was entrapped in the chase to beginning in the AWA. He didn't have an amateur background, so Vern Gagne wasn't in a rush to give him the title. Nick Bockwinkel did have an amateur background. Nick Bockwinkel was, very close to Vern Gagne. Bockwinkel and Gagne had traded the title back and forth forever in the AWA. They were top guys, best friends, and all this kind of stuff. They had always had good matches together and everything. So Gagne didn't see Hogan as being the world champion. He didn't have the wrestling chops. He didn't have the grappling skills. So to go to Vince, who didn't give a shit, who was like, this guy prints money, we're just going to go with it. And who cares if he's not a great grappler? Which most people, when you draw enough money, that's kind of how it gets. Like Bruno Sammartino was that guy too. He wasn't really a good wrestler when he started. Again, I think I've said it 100 times on this channel. You can find news paperclip articles of guys talking about how terrible Bruno is as a wrestler. And so Vince Sr. sent them around the horn to get him a little bit of seasoning. But ultimately, he realized that it doesn't really matter. The big deal here is, does he draw money? And that's what the Sheik was a victim of, not of Hulk Hogan's politicking or anything like that. He was a victim of Hogan's success. Hogan had just come off of the chase at the AWA. They weren't doing that in WWE. They wanted this dragon to be slayed, and they had to have a knight come from the outside of the kingdom in order to slay him, and that being Hulk Hogan. And I love how they put it in the biography that without the Iron Sheik, you wouldn't have Hulk Hogan. And they do that a lot lately. Without Roddy Piper, there wouldn't have been a WrestleMania. It's like, yeah, we understand. You need to have both sides. Okay, you need to have the good guy and the bad guy. The better the bad guy, the better the good guy looks. That's how these stories work. So that was fun. I was kind of disappointed they didn't go into a lot with the Sergeant Slaughter stuff in the biography, in terms of Iron Sheik as Colonel Mustafa, which is one of Vince's rebranding of all of his 80s guys. He went through this period where in the early 90s, if you were still wrestling and you were from the 80s, all of a sudden you had to do something different. If you were Tony Atlas, you had to be Saba Simba. If you were Tito Santana, you had to be El Matador. So if you were the Iron Sheik, you had to be Colonel Mustafa. They just changing people's names. It's stupid, right? It makes no sense. So I'm surprised he didn't go more into that. I think it would have been fun, It would have been a lot more fun to go into something like that. If you've never seen the Sergeant Slaughter Iron Sheik boot camp match, it was nuts. It's nuts. You should probably watch it. Also, watch the Sergeant Slaughter Pat Patterson boot camp match too. That match was also pretty nutty. To go show you some 80s WWF stuff. Especially if you've never seen Pat Patterson wrestle before. I also, to close this out, I love the story, Iron Sheik and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. What was even better about this, if you don't know, they got arrested together. They were doing drugs and drinking and driving and stuff. And they were feuding at the time. The best thing about this is the news. Like the news clippings that they played in here. You got the news anchor who correctly notes that these two guys are supposed to be hated foes, and they're in the car together doing drugs and drinking, right? It's hilarious. And the best thing about it too, even better than the news, is that they wrestled each other right after they got arrested. And then Jim Duggan thought nobody would know, and it turns out everybody knew the next day. Of course, Vince fired both of them, which is what led to Iron Sheik's downfall. Is that after he lost his WWF job, Hacksaw Jim Duggan was probably in line for a big push. He ended up getting that clipped away too. He ended up getting brought back a little bit later, way before Sheik did, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. But Vince did eventually bring both of them back. The interesting thing about this is the question of whether wrestling is real or fake and kayfabe. Whether you think Vince was right or wrong to admit it, and he admitted it multiple times. All right, some people say it was in 1985, the Boston Globe article where he wouldn't answer the question whether it was real or fake. He would just say we're in the sports entertainment field, or in New Jersey, when I think it was 1989, when he just said that we're in sports entertainment and outcomes are predetermined, and he said all of this to try to avoid taxes. Which, right thing to do. Who cares? Why pay taxes if you don't have to? In any event, even though it didn't work, which was unfortunate. It didn't work at the time, I should say. He won the long game. But even if you didn't think that it was the right thing to do, what would you do in a situation where these guys are together and they get arrested? And now the news media knows. And the news have been trying to sort of bust wrestling for a long time. Even long before Vince had ripped the curtain down, people in the media, and you had referees, other promoters, etc., outing the business for their own personal gain or out of revenge towards the NWA for what they had done, or towards other promoters or other wrestlers or whatever, and just trying to expose the business for their own personal gain. And Vince was no different. He exposed the business for his own personal gain. So, but it wasn't out of revenge or because he hated a promoter or because he hated a wrestler or he wanted to get back at somebody. It was because he didn't want to pay fucking taxes. Traditional wrestling historian logic is that Vince McMahon fired Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Iron Sheik for exposing the business, which is something he did kind of in 1985, kind of did it in 87, and did do it once and for all in 89. And he's a hypocrite for that, etc. When in reality, they're kind of ignoring the fact that these two guys got busted with drugs. Like, they got caught with drugs. So, no matter about the exposing the business part, that part is tame in comparison to the fact that they got caught with grams of coke on their person while they're driving. Like, all this is a compound fracture. This is a lot of, this is not one issue. This is multiple issues that they brought together. So I always loved that story. I loved the news media pieces that they brought in there. That was great. It's always fun to see Hacksaw Jim Duggan tell that story because he's always so enthusiastic about that story, especially the part where Sheik is very excited that he tested positive for cocaine. And the miscommunications is always pretty funny. Brett saying that Sheik thought that his $100,000 check was $10,000. He thought testing positive was a good thing, which is hilarious. It's just to show how simple this guy is, right? He's a very simple man. But I thought it was a fantastic biography. It was very well told. Again, a lot of it is in the Sheik's independent biography that he did on himself. It also showed more about his relationship to the Magen boys, Magen, those guys who run his Twitter account, and they made him a social media phenomenon and all this kind of stuff. They didn't talk about them at all in here, which is cool. I got enough of those guys in the other biography, which I think is raw. That one is more raw. This one is more wrestling. That one is more focused on Sheik as a man. This one is more focused on him as a character and what he means to the business. And he's an unsung hero. So even though I started this talking about, hey, he was a guy who kind of was a rip-off of another guy, it's not really the case. He carved his own niche in the business, and he is underrated. And he is one of the great villains that nobody ever just talks about or discusses because he wasn't champion that long. And in today's wrestling world, you have to be Triple H world champion for 10 months or whatever in order to get the respect that you deserve. But Iron Sheik was tremendous. He was a very fun character, especially when I was a kid. And I thoroughly enjoyed this. What did you guys think? Do all the YouTube things. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.